Patricia Wilson had never been one for attention. After 23 years on the federal bench, she had seen enough courtroom drama to last several lifetimes. When she came home, all she wanted was peace, quiet, and the simple comfort of her 5-acre property nestled in the countryside. The old corn barn sat about 100 yards from her modest farmhouse. It wasn't much to look at, honestly. The wood had weathered to a soft gray over the decades, and the roof had a slight sag on the eastern side. But to Patricia, that barn was everything. Her father had built it with his own hands back in 1967, and she could still remember being 6 years old, handing him nails while he worked in the summer sun. Inside that barn, her father had stored corn from their small harvest every fall. He would let her climb up on the feed sacks and tell her stories about growing up during harder times. Even after he passed away 12 years ago, Patricia kept the barn exactly as he had left it. His old tools still hung on the walls. The wooden ladder he had crafted still leaned against the loft. A few family photo albums sat wrapped in plastic bins protected from the moisture. For 15 years, Patricia had lived on this property without any problems. Her neighbors were spread out, friendly folks who waved when they drove by and helped each other out when needed. Old Frank down the road would bring her tomatoes from his garden. The Hendersons across the way had her feed their cats when they went on vacation. Then the county decided to incorporate their rural stretch into a planned community. Suddenly, Patricia's quiet corner of the world had rules, an HOA, Homeowners Association. 3 words that made her stomach turn. At first, the changes seemed minor. A monthly newsletter, a small fee. Patricia paid it without complaint, hoping that would be the end of it. She had dealt with far more complicated legal matters in her courtroom. This seemed manageable. Then Victoria Sterling got elected as HOA president. Victoria had moved to the area about 2 years earlier. She came from a wealthy suburb, and she made sure everyone knew it. Her house was the largest in the neighborhood, a sprawling modern construction with pristine white columns and a lawn so perfect it looked artificial. She drove a luxury SUV that she kept spotlessly clean, and she wore designer clothes even to check her mailbox. The first time Patricia met Victoria was at a mandatory HOA meeting. Patricia had dressed casually in jeans and a simple sweater, coming straight from a weekend of working in her garden. She introduced herself as Pat, which is what her friends had always called her. She preferred to keep her professional life separate from her personal life. Too many people acted differently once they knew she was a federal judge. Victoria had looked her up and down with barely concealed judgment. "Well, Pat, I hope you're planning to do something about that eyesore on your property." Patricia had been confused. Eyesore? That falling down barn? It's bringing down property values for the entire community. We're trying to maintain certain standards here. Patricia had felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice calm. That barn has historical value. My father built it. It's structurally sound, and it's on my property set back from the road. Victoria had smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm sure it's very sentimental, but we have to think about the community as a whole. I'll be sending you information about removal services. There are companies that can tear it down in a day. That was just the beginning. Over the next 3 months, Patricia received a letter from the HOA almost every week. First, it was about the barn. Then it was about her lawn being a 1/4 inch too long. Then her mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Her garden fence violated some obscure regulation about boundary markers. Each letter came with a fine attached. Patricia tried to be reasonable. She invited Victoria over for coffee, thinking they could discuss things civilly. She explained the barn's history, showed Victoria pictures of her father building it, told her about the memories contained inside those walls. Victoria had sipped her coffee and nodded politely, but Patricia could see she wasn't really listening. "I understand nostalgia," Victoria had said, "but progress requires sacrifice. This neighborhood is evolving. We can't have structures that look like they belong in the 1960s. What would potential buyers think?" "I'm not selling," Patricia had said quietly. "Well, not now, perhaps, but eventually. And when you do, wouldn't you want the best possible value?" Patricia had tried another approach. The barn is protected under county historical preservation guidelines for structures over 50 years old. Victoria had waved her hand dismissively. HOA regulations supersede county guidelines in planned communities. "I've checked with our lawyers." That had almost made Patricia smile. Victoria had no idea she was talking to someone who had spent decades interpreting law at the federal level. But Patricia held her tongue. She didn't want to play that card. She just wanted to be left alone. But Victoria didn't leave her alone. The letters kept coming. The fines increased. Victoria started showing up at Patricia's property unannounced, taking photos of the barn from different angles. She brought other HOA board members with her, pointing out every weathered board, every patch of peeling paint. Patricia's neighbors started apologizing to her in hushed tones. Victoria's gotten out of control, Frank had told her. She's fining everyone for everything. The Hendersons got hit with a $500 fine because their Christmas lights were up 3 days past New Year's. Patricia had dealt with difficult people her entire career. Aggressive attorneys, hostile witnesses, defendants who thought they could intimidate her. She had maintained her composure through it all. But there was something about Victoria's relentless campaign against her father's barn that got under her skin. It wasn't just about property values. Patricia could see that. It was about power. Victoria had found a little kingdom where she could rule, and she couldn't stand that someone wasn't bowing to her demands. One evening, Patricia came home from a particularly long day in court. A case involving corporate fraud that had lasted 3 weeks. She was exhausted, looking forward to changing into comfortable clothes and sitting on her porch with a cup of tea. Instead, she found Victoria standing in her driveway with a measuring tape. "What are you doing?" Patricia had asked, trying to keep her voice level. "Documenting violations," Victoria said without looking up. "Your fence is 6 inches over the property line into the HOA common easement. That fence has been there for 20 years. Then it's been in violation for 20 years. I'm assessing accumulated fines." Patricia had felt something snap inside her. "Get off my property." Victoria had finally looked up, her eyes cold. "Excuse me? You heard me. Get off my property now. You don't have permission to be here, and you certainly don't have permission to measure anything. I'm the HOA president. I have every right, not without notice and not without my consent. Leave now." Victoria's face had flushed red. She had gathered her things slowly, deliberately, making Patricia wait. As she got into her pristine SUV, she had rolled down the window. "You're going to regret this, Pat. That barn is coming down one way or another. I'll make sure of it." Patricia had watched her drive away, feeling a cold sense of dread settle in her stomach. She had seen enough criminals and corrupt people to recognize a threat when she heard one. But even with all her experience, even with her instincts warning her, Patricia never imagined how far Victoria would actually go. She should have. Because 2 weeks later, while Patricia was 300 miles away presiding over a federal trial, her phone rang at 2 in the morning. It was Frank, his voice shaking. "Patricia, you need to come home. Your barn. There's been a fire." The drive home felt like it took forever. Patricia had immediately requested an emergency recess from the trial, grabbed her things, and driven through the night. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles had turned white. Frank's words kept echoing in her head. Fire. Barn. Gone. She pulled into her driveway just as the sun was starting to rise. The smell hit her first, that acrid, bitter smell of burned wood that seemed to coat the back of her throat. Then she saw it. Where her father's barn had stood for over 50 years, there was nothing but a pile of blackened timber and ash. A few support beams still stood, charred and skeletal against the morning sky. Everything else had collapsed in on itself. Patricia sat in her car for a long moment, unable to move. She had prepared herself during the drive, told herself it would be bad. But seeing it in person was different. This wasn't just wood and nails. This was her father's hands. His stories. Her childhood. All reduced to ashes. Frank walked over to her car. His face was drawn, exhausted. He had clearly been up all night. "I'm so sorry, Patricia. I called the fire department as soon as I saw the flames, but it was already too far gone. They got here fast, but there wasn't much they could do except make sure it didn't spread to your house." Patricia got out of the car slowly. Her legs felt unsteady. "What happened?" "Fire marshal is still here. He's been investigating since about 4 this morning. You should talk to him." The fire marshal was a stocky man in his 50s named Chief Rodriguez. He had been documenting the scene, taking photos and measurements. When Patricia approached, he looked up from his clipboard with sympathetic eyes. "Ms. Wilson? I'm Chief Rodriguez. I'm very sorry for your loss." Patricia nodded, not trusting her voice yet. I need to ask you some questions if you're up for it. When was the last time you were in the barn? About 10 days ago. I checked on it before I left for a work trip. Any electrical in there? Space heaters, lights, anything like that? No. My father designed it without electricity. He always said it was safer that way for storing grain. There are some battery-powered lanterns, but that's it. Chief Rodriguez nodded, making notes. That's what I thought. Ms. Wilson, I've been doing this job for 26 years. This wasn't an accident. Patricia felt her stomach drop. You're sure? Positive. We found clear evidence of accelerant. Someone poured gasoline or something similar around the base of the structure. We found 3 distinct pour patterns. This was deliberate. Patricia closed her eyes. She had suspected, but hearing it confirmed made it real. Arson. Yes, ma'am. This is now a criminal investigation. I've already contacted the sheriff's department. Detective Chen will be here shortly to take a statement. I know who did it, Patricia said quietly. Chief Rodriguez looked up sharply. You do? Victoria Sterling. She's the HOA president. She's been harassing me for months to tear down this barn. She threatened me 2 weeks ago. Told me the barn would come down one way or another. The fire marshal was writing quickly now. Did you report that threat? Patricia shook her head. I should have. I just thought she was blowing off steam. I never imagined she would actually. Frank stepped forward. Chief, I might have seen something. Night before last, around 11:30. I was letting my dog out and I saw a car driving real slow past Patricia's property with its lights off. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Can you describe the vehicle? Big white SUV, looked expensive. One of those luxury models. Patricia and Frank exchanged glances. Victoria drove a white Range Rover. There's more, Frank continued. The Hendersons across the way. They installed one of those doorbell cameras a few months back after some package thefts. It faces the road. Might have caught something. Chief Rodriguez was already pulling out his phone. I'll need to talk to them right away. Detective Chen arrived 20 minutes later. She was a sharp-eyed woman who listened carefully as Patricia recounted the entire history with Victoria. The letters, the fines, the harassment, the threat. Patricia showed her the stack of HOA correspondence she had kept, each letter more aggressive than the last. I have to ask, Detective Chen said. Is there any reason Miss Sterling might believe you're a particular threat to her position or authority? Patricia hesitated. This was the moment. The moment where she would have to reveal who she really was. She doesn't know what I do for a living. I'm a federal judge. I kept that information private because I prefer to keep my work life separate. Detective Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. A federal judge. Yes, but Victoria thinks I'm just a regular homeowner. Someone she could bully into compliance. That's going to be relevant, Detective Chen said. Shows her level of confidence in getting away with this. The Hendersons were cooperative. Tom Henderson pulled up the footage from his doorbell camera immediately. They all crowded around his laptop in his living room, watching the grainy nighttime video. At 11:27 p.m., a white Range Rover drove slowly past Patricia's driveway. The license plate was partially visible. The vehicle's lights were off just as Frank had described. That's her car, Patricia said. I've seen it dozens of times. Can you make out the driver? Detective Chen asked. Tom enhanced the video as much as he could. The driver's face wasn't clear, but they could see blonde hair and a distinctive jacket. A cream-colored designer coat with large buttons. She wears that coat all the time, Patricia said. It's some expensive brand. She told me once it cost $2,000. Detective Chen took copies of the video footage. This is good, but we need more. We need to place her at the scene and prove she set the fire. Over the next few hours, more pieces fell into place. Another neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who lived 3 houses down, remembered seeing the same white SUV parked on the shoulder near the entrance to the community around midnight. She had noticed because it seemed odd for such an expensive car to be parked on the roadside. The tire tracks near Patricia's barn matched the tread pattern of Range Rover tires. The fire marshal found a gas can in the brush about 50 yards from the barn, partially hidden under some leaves. It still had traces of gasoline inside. No fingerprints, but Victoria had apparently been smart enough to wear gloves. But she hadn't been smart enough to cover all her tracks. One of the younger HOA board members, a man named Kevin who had never seemed comfortable with Victoria's aggressive tactics, came forward that afternoon. He had been at Victoria's house the evening before the fire for a board meeting. She was really worked up about Pat's barn. Kevin told Detective Chen, She kept saying something had to be done, that Pat was making a fool of her, refusing to comply. Then she said something that made me uncomfortable at the time, but I didn't think she meant it literally. What did she say? Detective Chen asked. Kevin looked uncomfortable. She said maybe that old barn needs to have an accident. Things burn down all the time in the country. Old wood is so dangerous. Some of the other board members laughed nervously, but Victoria wasn't laughing. She had this look in her eyes. Cold. Determined. Detective Chen interviewed the other board members who had been at that meeting. 2 of them confirmed Kevin's account. Victoria had made multiple comments about the barn burning down, about how it would solve everyone's problems. By late afternoon, Detective Chen had enough. She called Patricia, who was sitting on her porch staring at the ruins of her father's barn. "We're bringing her in for questioning," Detective Chen said. "The evidence is circumstantial, but it's adding up. Her vehicle at the scene, the timing, the threats, the statements to witnesses. We're executing a search warrant on her home and vehicle. If she used that gas can, there might be traces in her car or garage." Patricia felt something cold settle in her chest. Not satisfaction. Not quite. Just a grim sense of inevitability. "When?" "Within the hour. I wanted you to know." "And Ms. Wilson? I did some research on you after our conversation. Your reputation is impressive. 23 years on the federal bench, not a single decision overturned on appeal." Victoria Sterling picked the wrong person to mess with. Patricia almost smiled. She doesn't know that yet. She's about to. Patricia sat on her porch as the sun began to set, watching the shadows grow long across the ashes of her father's barn. Somewhere across town, Victoria Sterling was about to have a very bad evening, and tomorrow, Patricia thought, tomorrow the real reckoning would begin. Victoria Sterling's arrest happened at 7:30 that evening. Patricia wasn't there to see it, but Frank called her immediately after, his voice filled with a mixture of shock and satisfaction. "You should have seen it, Patricia. 3 sheriff's vehicles pulled up to her house. Detective Chen knocked on her door, very professional, and asked her to come down to the station for questioning. Victoria started yelling about harassment and abuse of power. Then they told her they had a search warrant. Patricia listened quietly, feeling nothing like the victory she had expected, just emptiness. She demanded to call her lawyer, Frank continued, kept screaming that she was going to sue everyone involved. They searched her garage and found traces of gasoline on the concrete floor. Fresh stains. Looks like she spilled some when she was filling that gas can. That night, Patricia couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her father, about all the memories that had been destroyed. The photo albums had been reduced to ash, his handmade tools melted and warped beyond recognition. Even the wooden ladder he had crafted, the one she used to climb as a child, was gone. At 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep and made herself tea. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and started reading the police reports that Detective Chen had emailed her. The evidence was substantial. The gas can had been purchased from a hardware store 15 miles away, paid for in cash, but the store's security footage showed someone matching Victoria's description and wearing that distinctive cream coat. More damning was what they found in Victoria's home office. A folder labeled Barn Project containing printed satellite images of Patricia's property with the barn, circled in red. Notes about wind direction and optimal burning conditions, a checklist that made Patricia's blood run cold. Victoria had planned this meticulously. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. Victoria posted bail, but the judge set strict conditions. She was to have no contact with Patricia or any witnesses. She was removed from her position as HOA president pending the outcome of the case. But Victoria wasn't done fighting. 3 days after her arrest, Patricia received a certified letter from Victoria's attorney. It was a lawsuit. Victoria was suing Patricia for defamation, emotional distress, and false accusations. The lawsuit claimed that Patricia had orchestrated a conspiracy to frame Victoria because of their HOA dispute. Patricia read the lawsuit in her chambers at the courthouse. Her clerk, a young woman named Rachel who had worked with her for 5 years, noticed her expression. "Judge Wilson, everything okay?" Patricia handed her the lawsuit. Rachel read it, her eyes growing wider with each page. "This is absurd. She's the one who committed arson. The evidence is overwhelming." "It's the intimidation tactic," Patricia said calmly. "She's trying to make me back down, make me seem like the aggressor." She still doesn't understand who she's dealing with. That afternoon, Patricia did something she rarely did. She called a press conference. As a federal judge, she typically avoided media attention. But this situation required a different approach. The local news stations showed up along with reporters from the regional papers. Patricia stood on the steps of the courthouse in her judge's robes, presenting the facts clearly and without emotion. I am speaking today not as a judge, but as a private citizen who has been the victim of a crime. 3 weeks ago, my property was deliberately destroyed by arson. The structure that was burned held immense sentimental value. It was built by my late father over 50 years ago. She paused, letting that sink in. The person charged with this crime is Victoria Sterling, who until recently served as president of my homeowners association. For months, Ms. Sterling harassed me to remove this structure, despite it being legally protected. She made threats. She issued excessive fines. When I refused to comply with her unlawful demands, she took matters into her own hands. The reporters were scribbling furiously. Camera flashes went off. I want to be clear about something. Ms. Sterling believed she was targeting an ordinary homeowner who could be bullied and intimidated. She did not know my professional background. She did not know that I have spent over 2 decades upholding the law and ensuring justice is served. This was not a personal vendetta, as her lawsuit claims. This is simply a matter of holding someone accountable for a serious crime. A reporter raised her hand. Judge Wilson, what do you say to Ms. Sterling's claims that you framed her? Patricia's expression didn't change. The evidence speaks for itself. Security footage, witness statements, physical evidence, and Ms. Sterling's own documented threats. I would encourage anyone interested in the truth to examine the public record once the case goes to trial. The press conference made waves. By that evening, the story had spread across the state. Victoria Sterling, wealthy HOA president, arrested for burning down a federal judge's barn. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Victoria's lawsuit quietly disappeared 2 days later. Her attorney withdrew it without explanation, though Patricia suspected he had finally realized the optics of suing an arson victim were catastrophic. The preliminary hearing arrived. Patricia sat in the courtroom, but not in her usual seat behind the bench. She sat in the gallery, just another citizen seeking justice. The presiding judge was a colleague, Judge Mitchell, who treated the case with appropriate gravity. Victoria appeared with her high-priced defense attorney, a man named Lawrence Bradford who specialized in defending wealthy clients. He was smooth, expensive, and very good at his job. Bradford stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, my client maintains her complete innocence. The evidence against her is entirely circumstantial. Ms. Sterling has no criminal record. She is a respected member of the community, a successful businesswoman, and a dedicated public servant who volunteered her time to improve her neighborhood. Detective Chen presented the prosecution's evidence methodically. The security footage, the witness statements, the gas can, the tire tracks, the incriminating notes found in Victoria's office. Bradford countered each point. The footage is grainy and unclear. The gas can had no fingerprints. The notes could have been researched for a completely innocent purpose. My client was concerned about fire safety in the neighborhood. That's why she took photos and notes about old structures. Judge Mitchell listened to both sides, his expression neutral. Then it was time for Victoria to speak. Her attorney advised her to remain silent, but Victoria couldn't help herself. She stood up, her voice shaking with indignation. This is a witch hunt. I have been targeted because I tried to maintain standards in our community. Ms. Wilson refused to follow HOA regulations that everyone else follows. She thinks she's above the rules. Judge Mitchell raised his eyebrows. Ms. Sterling, I would advise you to stop speaking. But Victoria was on a roll, months of frustration pouring out. That barn was a hazard. It was ugly. It was bringing down everyone's property values. Something had to be done. The HOA board supported me. Everyone supported me. Her attorney was tugging on her sleeve, trying to get her to sit down, but Victoria shook him off. And then I find out she's been hiding who she really is. A federal judge. She let me think she was just some regular person. She deceived everyone. And now she's using her position to destroy my life over a stupid old barn that should have been torn down years ago. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even Bradford had stopped trying to quiet her. He just stood there with his head in his hands. Judge Mitchell looked at Victoria with something close to disbelief. Ms. Sterling, did you just admit that you believe the barn should have been torn down and that something had to be done about it? Victoria seemed to realize her mistake. Her face went pale. I wasn't saying that I... Sit down, Ms. Sterling. Victoria sat, her hands trembling. Judge Mitchell reviewed his notes for a long moment. Then he looked up. Based on the evidence presented and the defendant's own statements in this courtroom, I find sufficient probable cause to bind this case over for trial. Ms. Sterling will remain free on bail under the existing conditions. Trial date will be set within 60 days. He struck his gavel. Patricia walked out of the courtroom feeling the weight of the past weeks settling on her shoulders. Victoria had practically confessed in open court. Her attorney would probably try to walk it back, claim she was emotional and misspoke. But Patricia knew juries. She knew how they thought, how they evaluated credibility, and she knew that Victoria Sterling had just made a catastrophic mistake. Outside the courthouse, Frank was waiting for her. How did it go? Patricia allowed herself a small smile. Victoria testified against herself. Really? Really? Sometimes the guilty can't help but reveal themselves. They think they're in control right up until the moment they realize they're not. The trial was coming, and Patricia intended to be there for every single moment of it. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in late November. Patricia arrived early, sitting in the back row of the courtroom. She had taken a leave of absence from her own cases to see this through. Some of her colleagues had questioned whether she should be present at all, whether it looked vindictive, but Patricia didn't care about appearances anymore. This was personal. Victoria walked in wearing a conservative navy suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked nothing like the aggressive HOA president who had terrorized the neighborhood. This was the version of Victoria designed for sympathy, humble, restrained, remorseful. But Patricia had seen this transformation before in countless defendants. The courtroom makeover, the carefully practiced expressions of regret. It rarely worked with experienced juries. The prosecution was being handled by Assistant District Attorney Helen Torres, a sharp woman in her 40s with an impressive conviction rate. Patricia had appeared in her courtroom before on federal matters, and she respected Helen's methodical approach to building cases. Jury selection took 2 days. Bradford, Victoria's attorney, tried to eliminate anyone who seemed too sympathetic to property rights or had negative experiences with HOAs. Helen countered by ensuring the jury included homeowners who understood the sanctity of personal property. In the end, they had 12 jurors, 6 men, 6 women, ages ranging from 28 to 67, a good mix of backgrounds and experiences. Helen's opening statement was direct and powerful. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a woman who believed she was above the law. Victoria Sterling didn't like her neighbor's barn. She thought it was ugly. She thought it hurt property values. So she decided to take matters into her own hands, not through legal channels, not through proper procedures, but through fire. Helen walked slowly in front of the jury box. The evidence will show that Ms. Sterling made repeated threats against Patricia Wilson's property. She documented the barn's location, researched optimal burning conditions, and purchased accelerant. Then, in the middle of the night, she drove to Ms. Wilson's property and deliberately set fire to a structure that had stood for over 50 years. A structure that contained irreplaceable family memories and historical value. She paused, making eye contact with each juror. Ms. Sterling gambled that she wouldn't get caught. She gambled that even if she did, her money and position would protect her. She was wrong on both counts. The evidence against her is overwhelming, and no amount of expensive legal representation can change the facts. Bradford's opening statement took a different approach. He painted Victoria as a dedicated community volunteer, overwhelmed by responsibility and unfairly targeted because of a personal dispute. My client never set that fire, Bradford said smoothly. Yes, she disagreed with Ms. Wilson about HOA regulations. Yes, she took photos and made notes about the property. That was her job as HOA president. But disagreement is not arson. Doing your job is not a crime. He gestured toward Victoria, who sat with her hands folded, looking small and vulnerable. The prosecution wants you to believe that Victoria Sterling, a successful businesswoman with everything to lose, would risk her entire life over a barn. That she would commit a felony because of a neighborhood dispute. Does that make sense? Or does it make more sense that someone else set that fire, and the authorities simply took the easiest path to an arrest? Patricia watched the jury's faces. A few seemed thoughtful. Most looked skeptical. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 days. Helen called witness after witness, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. Frank testified about seeing the white SUV with its lights off driving past Patricia's property. Mrs. Chen confirmed seeing the same vehicle parked on the roadside late that night. Tom Henderson presented the doorbell camera footage, and the courtroom went silent as they watched the white Range Rover creep slowly past Patricia's driveway. "Can you identify whose vehicle that is?" Helen asked. "That's Victoria Sterling's Range Rover," Tom said firmly. "I've seen it dozens of times. Same model, same color, same license plate number." Chief Rodriguez testified about the accelerant patterns and the deliberately set nature of the fire. He explained how the pour patterns indicated someone had walked around the barn's perimeter, ensuring maximum damage. "In your professional opinion, was this fire accidental?" Helen asked. "Absolutely not. This was textbook arson, premeditated and carefully executed." Detective Chen presented the gas can found near the scene and the security footage from the hardware store showing someone matching Victoria's description purchasing an identical can 2 days before the fire. But the most damaging testimony came from Kevin, the young HOA board member. He looked uncomfortable on the witness stand, avoiding eye contact with Victoria. "Tell us about the meeting at Ms. Sterling's house on the evening of November 4th, Helen said. Kevin cleared his throat. "We were discussing ongoing HOA business. Ms. Sterling brought up Patricia Wilson's barn again. She was really frustrated that Ms. Wilson wouldn't comply with the removal order." "What exactly did she say?" "She said, that barn needs to disappear. If Patricia won't do it, maybe nature will take care of it. Old wood burns so easily." Then she laughed, but it wasn't a funny laugh, it was cold. Did anyone respond to that statement? A couple board members laughed nervously. I said something like, "You don't mean that," and she just looked at me and said, "Don't I?" Then she changed the subject. Bradford cross-examined aggressively, trying to suggest Kevin was misremembering or had a grudge against Victoria. But Kevin held firm. 2 other board members corroborated his testimony. On the 4th day, Helen played her final card. She called a forensic expert who had analyzed the gasoline residue found in Victoria's garage. "The chemical composition matches the accelerant used at the fire scene," the expert testified. "Same brand, same mixture of compounds. The probability of this being a coincidence is statistically negligible." Bradford tried to argue that Victoria could have spilled gas while filling up a lawnmower or generator, but when Helen pointed out that Victoria's property had a professional landscaping service and no need for gas-powered equipment, that explanation fell apart. Then it was the defense's turn. Bradford called character witnesses who testified to Victoria's community involvement and charitable work. Her pastor spoke about her dedication to the church. Business associates praised her ethics and professionalism, but none of them could explain away the evidence. Bradford made a bold move on the 5th day. He called Victoria to the stand. Patricia leaned forward, watching carefully. This was a huge risk. If Victoria lost her temper like she had at the preliminary hearing, the case was over. Victoria took the oath, her hand steady, her voice clear. Bradford walked her through a carefully rehearsed narrative. She spoke about her commitment to the neighborhood, her concern for property values, and her belief that she was simply doing her job. "Did you set fire to Patricia Wilson's barn?" Bradford asked. "No, absolutely not. I would never do something like that." "Why do you think you've been accused of this crime?" Victoria's eyes welled with tears. It was a good performance, Patricia had to admit. "I think Ms. Wilson was angry that I was enforcing HOA rules. When her barn burned down, she saw an opportunity to get revenge on me for doing my job. She used her position as a federal judge to pressure law enforcement into making an arrest." Helen's cross-examination was brutal. "Ms. Sterling, you testified that you were simply enforcing HOA rules. Is it true that you sent Ms. Wilson 14 violation notices in 3 months?" I don't recall the exact number. Let me refresh your memory. Helen held up a stack of letters. 14 notices, for things like grass being a quarter-inch too long and her mailbox being the wrong shade of paint. Does that seem reasonable? Victoria's composure started to crack. Those were legitimate violations. You also testified that you never threatened Ms. Wilson. But we have multiple witnesses who heard you say the barn needed to disappear and that old wood burns easily. Do you deny saying that? I may have said something in frustration, but I didn't mean it literally. You didn't mean it literally when you said old wood burns easily 2 days before Ms. Wilson's wooden barn burned to the ground. It was just a figure of speech. Helen pulled out the folder found in Victoria's office. Can you explain this? Folder labeled Barn Project containing satellite images of Ms. Wilson's property and notes about wind direction. Victoria's face flushed. I was documenting the property for HOA records. Why would HOA records need information about wind direction and optimal burning conditions? I never wrote that. This is your handwriting, isn't it? The same handwriting on these HOA violation notices? Victoria glanced at her attorney, panic flashing across her face. I want to invoke my Fifth Amendment right. You can't do that, Ms. Sterling. You chose to testify. You have to answer the question. Judge Mitchell nodded. The witness will answer. Victoria sat silent for a long moment. Then quietly she said, I don't remember writing those notes. The jury didn't believe her. Patricia could see it in their faces, the skepticism, the recognition of someone caught in a lie. Helen had one final question. Ms. Sterling, do you own a cream-colored designer coat with large buttons? Yes. The same coat visible in the security footage from the hardware store where the gas can was purchased? Victoria didn't answer. She just stared at her hands. No further questions, Helen said. Court adjourned for the day. Patricia walked out into the late afternoon sun, feeling the weight of the week settling on her shoulders. Frank was waiting outside. How's it looking? Patricia watched Victoria exit through a side door, surrounded by her legal team. She's done. She knows it too. The closing arguments began on a gray Friday morning. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the trial, and people from the community had shown up to watch the conclusion. Patricia recognized several faces from the neighborhood, including most of the HOA board members who had quietly distanced themselves from Victoria. Helen Torres stood before the jury, her voice steady and confident. Over the past week, you've heard overwhelming evidence of guilt. You've seen security footage of the defendant's vehicle at the scene. You've heard witness testimony about her threats. You've seen the incriminating notes in her own handwriting. You've heard her admit to making statements about how easily old wood burns, just days before a wooden barn mysteriously burned to the ground. Helen walked along the jury box, making eye contact with each juror, but perhaps most telling was what you witnessed in this very courtroom. When confronted with evidence, Victoria Sterling couldn't provide a coherent explanation. She claimed not to remember writing notes about optimal burning conditions. She invoked her Fifth Amendment right in the middle of testifying. These are not the actions of an innocent woman. These are the actions of someone who got caught. She paused, letting the words sink in. Victoria Sterling believed she could get away with this crime because she thought Patricia Wilson was just an ordinary person. Someone without resources or connections. Someone who could be bullied and intimidated. She was wrong. But this case isn't about who Patricia Wilson is professionally. It's about a fundamental principle. No one is above the law. Not HOA presidents. Not wealthy businesswomen. No one. Helen returned to her table. The evidence is clear. The testimony is damning. I ask you to return the only verdict supported by the facts. Guilty on all counts. Bradford's closing argument was passionate but defensive. He focused on reasonable doubt, suggesting alternative theories and questioning the circumstantial nature of some evidence. But Patricia could see he was grasping at straws. His client had damaged her own case beyond repair. Ask yourselves, Bradford said, is the prosecution's timeline really as airtight as they claim? Could someone else have set this fire and let Ms. Sterling take the fall? My client may have made some unfortunate statements in frustration, but words are not crimes. Actions are crimes. and the prosecution has not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Victoria Sterling committed this action. It was a good effort, but Patricia knew it wouldn't be enough. Judge Mitchell gave the jury their instructions, explaining the elements of arson and the burden of proof. Then the 12 jurors filed out to deliberate. Patricia waited in a small conference room down the hall. Helen had invited her to wait there instead of in the public gallery. Frank joined her along with Tom Henderson and his wife. "How long do you think it'll take?" Frank asked. Patricia shrugged. "Could be hours. Could be days. Juries are unpredictable." But it wasn't hours or days. 90 minutes after they began deliberating, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. "That was fast," Helen said, gathering her files. "Fast verdicts usually mean strong convictions one way or another. Based on the evidence, I'm confident it's in our favor." The courtroom filled quickly. Victoria sat at the defense table, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly together. Bradford whispered something to her, but she didn't seem to hear him. She was staring straight ahead, looking at nothing. Patricia took her seat in the gallery. Her heart was pounding, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. 23 years as a judge, and she still felt nervous when she was on the other side of the proceedings. The jury filed in. Patricia had learned long ago to read jury faces. Some looked at the defendant, some looked away, but none of them looked at Victoria with sympathy. That told her everything she needed to know. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Mitchell asked. The foreman, a middle-aged man who worked as an accountant, stood up. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of first-degree arson, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." Victoria made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Bradford put his hand on her arm, but she shook him off. "On the charge of destruction of property, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of making terroristic threats, how do you find?" "Guilty." 3 guilty verdicts. Victoria slumped in her chair, covering her face with her hands. Some people in the gallery gasped. Others nodded quietly, as if this was exactly what they'd expected. Judge Mitchell thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. He remanded Victoria to custody immediately, revoking her bail. 2 bailiffs came forward and helped Victoria stand. She looked around the courtroom, wild-eyed as if searching for someone who could save her. Her eyes landed on Patricia. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Victoria's expression was a mixture of hatred, disbelief, and something that might have been regret. Then the bailiffs led her away through the side door. She was gone. The courtroom erupted in quiet conversation. Helen turned to Patricia, extending her hand. "Justice served." Patricia shook her hand. "Thank you for everything you did. You made it easy." She practically convicted herself. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. Patricia made a brief statement, keeping it simple and dignified. "I'm grateful to the jury for their careful consideration of the evidence. This was never about revenge or using my position for personal gain. It was about holding someone accountable for a serious crime. My father's barn is gone and nothing can bring it back, but at least there's been justice." She declined to answer questions and walked to her car with Frank beside her. "How do you feel?" Frank asked. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Empty," she finally said. "I thought I'd feel vindicated or satisfied, but I just feel empty. The barn is still gone. My father's tools, the photos, the memories. None of that comes back because Victoria was convicted." "No," Frank agreed, "but at least she can't hurt anyone else." 3 weeks later, Patricia returned for the sentencing hearing. Victoria appeared in an orange jumpsuit, looking nothing like the polished HOA president she'd once been. Her expensive haircut had grown out. She wore no makeup. She looked exhausted. Bradford made a plea for leniency, citing Victoria's lack of prior criminal record and her contributions to the community. Several character witnesses testified on her behalf. Then Judge Mitchell asked if Victoria wanted to make a statement. Victoria stood slowly. For a moment, Patricia thought she might actually apologize, but instead Victoria looked directly at her. "I lost everything because of you," Victoria said, her voice bitter. "My reputation, my position, my freedom, all because you couldn't follow simple HOA rules." Judge Mitchell cut her off. "Mrs. Sterling, I would advise you to stop talking." But Victoria couldn't stop. "You think you won? You think this is justice? You're just a bitter woman who couldn't let go of an old barn. You used your power to destroy my life." "That's enough," Judge Mitchell said sharply. "Sit down." Victoria sat, but her hands were shaking with anger. Judge Mitchell looked at her with something close to contempt. Ms. Sterling, even now, at your sentencing, you show no remorse. No understanding of the gravity of what you've done. You committed a premeditated act of destruction against another person's property because you believed yourself entitled to do so. Worse, you show no recognition that your actions were wrong. He paused, reviewing his notes. Arson is a serious crime. You could have started a fire that spread to neighboring homes. You could have killed someone. The fact that you didn't was luck, not restraint. You planned this crime carefully and executed it deliberately, and even now you blame the victim for your own criminal choices. Victoria stared at the table, her jaw clenched. Taking into account the seriousness of the offense, the premeditated nature of the crime, and your complete lack of remorse, I hereby sentence you to 15 years in state prison on the arson charge, to be served consecutively with 3 years for destruction of property, and 2 years for terroristic threats. 20 years total. Victoria's head snapped up. 20 years? For a barn? For arson, Ms. Sterling, for believing you were above the law, for trying to intimidate and terrorize your neighbor when she wouldn't bend to your will. Take her away. The bailiffs led Victoria out. She was crying now, all pretense of dignity gone. Patricia watched her go, feeling that same emptiness. 20 years seemed like justice on paper, but it didn't bring back what she'd lost. 6 months later, Patricia stood on her property, looking at the concrete foundation where her father's barn had once stood. Spring flowers were starting to grow around the edges, nature slowly reclaiming the scarred earth. Frank walked up beside her. Have you thought about rebuilding? Patricia nodded slowly. I have. Not exactly the same barn, but something to honor his memory. A smaller workshop maybe, a place to keep his tools that I managed to save from my house. A few photos I had stored elsewhere. That sounds nice. The HOA actually voted to dissolve itself last month, Patricia said with a slight smile. After Victoria's conviction, everyone realized how toxic the whole thing had become. We're going back to being a regular neighborhood. No rules about barn colors or lawn lengths. Your father would have liked that. He would have. Patricia took one last look at the empty foundation, then turned toward her house. The barn was gone. Victoria was in prison. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but the real healing, Patricia knew, would take time. It always did. You couldn't replace what was lost. You could only move forward and build something new, and that's exactly what she planned to do. Sometimes, Patricia thought, the people who believe they're above the law learn the hardest lessons. Victoria had thought her money and position made her untouchable. She'd thought she could bully and intimidate without consequences. She'd been wrong, and now she had 20 years to think about that mistake.